It was supposed to be a perfect family camping trip, a break from everything, just some time outdoors with my family, my best friend, and our dog. We had picked a spot that was right next to a trail system with about 13 miles of rough, rocky paths running through the forest and along the lake. The idea was simple: ride our bikes during the day, relax by the campfire at night, and enjoy the fresh air. The trails were tougher than I expected, mostly narrow with uneven dirt and gravel, twisted roots, and some pretty steep drops on the sides. The whole path had this wild, natural feeling, like it hadn't been made smooth or easy, just left as it was by time and weather. I liked that, felt real. That morning, we packed everything, loaded the bikes, and set off. The sun was bright but not too hot. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the lake's surface glistened a deep blue just to the side of the trail. Our dog, a medium-sized mutt with thick fur, was running along happily, sniffing everything. She'd been with us all day, trotting beside the bikes or running ahead to explore the woods on the edges of the trail. We'd been riding for hours, stopping sometimes to rest or take pictures. The trail was rough and narrow in spots, but nothing too bad. Then we came to the part I'll never forget. The trail narrowed suddenly, squeezed between a steep dirt hill on one side and the lake on the other. The hill was unlike anything else we'd seen. It looked like part of the land had given way years ago, leaving a sharp edge that dropped almost straight down into the water. I later found out it was about a 70-degree slope. Just looking at it made my stomach tighten. I slowed down, trying to be careful. The ground here was loose, gravel and dirt, not packed solid like the rest of the trail. The path itself was maybe 2 feet wide, barely enough space for a bike to pass safely. Our dog, instead of keeping to the trail like she had all day, suddenly veered off toward that narrow edge by the hill. I wasn't sure what she was thinking, but she was curious and eager to explore. She sniffed around, moving closer and closer to the edge. My dad was holding her leash, but she was strong and kept pulling. Then, without warning, she started to slide. Her paws dug into the loose gravel, but it wasn't enough to hold. Her feet slipped forward, and she began to slide down the hill. I froze, my heart stopping for a moment. My dad, who was holding the leash, got caught off guard. The sudden pull threw him off balance. I could see him lean backward, trying to hold on, but the ground was unstable under his feet too. I watched in pure horror as he started tipping over, his body falling toward the hill's edge. The dog was sliding faster now, and my dad was losing his footing. Felt like time slowed down. I couldn't move or shout. I was terrified, imagining them both tumbling down the steep slope, rolling over rocks and dirt, falling into the cold lake below. I could see the jagged rocks and branches weighting down the hill. It was a fall that could have meant serious injury or worse. But somehow, my dad managed to catch himself. I don't know how he found the strength or balance. Maybe it was pure adrenaline. He grabbed the leash tighter, pulled the dog close, and planted his feet firmly. He pulled the dog back up the slope and righted himself. Neither of them fell. Neither of them got hurt. It was a miracle, and I felt frozen, unable to fully breathe for a few minutes. I was shaking. After that, we slowly finished the rest of the trail, but none of us said much. No one wanted to think about what had just happened. We were all quiet, riding carefully, making sure the dog stayed far from the edge. When we got back to the campsite, I sat down for a long time. The whole day felt different now. What should have been fun had turned into a near disaster in just seconds. I thought about how close we'd come to losing my dad or the dog. I thought about how small mistakes or a moment's distraction could lead to something terrible. That trip was the last time I ever went on that trail. I never wanted to risk anything like that again. The memory of almost watching them roll down that hill stayed with me, a warning about how quickly things can go wrong in the wild. Now, whenever I think about that day, I remember how lucky we were. Lucky that my dad held on tight. Lucky that the dog's slip didn't turn into a fall. And lucky that we all made it back safe. It taught me something real about respect. Respect for nature, for the power of the land, and for how quickly a fun adventure can turn dangerous. From then on, every time I'm near a steep hill or a rough trail, I remember that day. I remember the feeling of my heart pounding, the breath caught in my throat, and the terrifying thought of losing the people and animals I care about. And I'm grateful. Grateful to be here, still safe, still able to look back and learn from it. Because sometimes, the scariest moments don't come from monsters or ghosts. They come from real life, from moments when the ground beneath you shifts, and all you can do is hold on tight and hope for the best. I was camping with a mate one summer night down on my parents' farm, near the river that runs through the property. The spot was a favorite for us when we wanted to get away, just a small clearing by the water, surrounded by thick scrub and trees. We pitched our tent close to the bank, where the soft murmur of the river mixed with the rustling leaves. My mate and I had been there a few hours, building a fire and talking about random stuff. The sun had set a while ago, and the sky was dark and clear, sprinkled with stars. The air was warm but cool enough to feel the moisture from the river. We had the fire going, small and bright, throwing shadows around the camp. The usual sounds of the farm at night were there. Frogs croaking, the gentle rush of water, a few distant owls hooting. Then, we started hearing noises. At first, we thought it was just the farm's usual wildlife. Possums, maybe a fox. But the noises sounded different, more deliberate, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves and twigs. Soft but close enough to make us pay attention. I turned to my mate and said, "That's weird. Probably your sister and her friends. They're always trying to mess with us when we camp out here." It made sense. My sister and her friends had a reputation for sneaking around the farm, especially at night, trying to spook us or just be annoying. We figured they had snuck down from the house to play a joke. I laughed it off, trying to shake off the slight unease settling in my chest. Then I looked out of the tent's mesh window, just a few meters from our fire. Standing still in the shadow of the trees was a figure, someone. I could see the faint outline of a person, tall, thin, standing very still next to the firelight, just watching us. It wasn't my sister or her friends. The figure froze the moment it noticed me looking. I locked eyes with them. They realized I'd seen them. Then, without a word or a sound, they turned and ran off into the thick scrub behind the camp, disappearing almost instantly. My heart started pounding in my chest. That was no joke. That was no prank. I turned to my mate and said in a low voice, "Let's just leave them here." We didn't want to stick around, not knowing who or what that was. We quickly got out of the tent, grabbed our jackets, and jumped on the quad bike parked nearby. The farmhouse was about 2 kilometers up the dirt track from the river, so we decided to get as far away as possible, fast. The quad roared to life and we sped away, leaving the fire and the strange figure behind us, wanting no part of whatever was out there. The ride up to the house was tense. Neither of us spoke much. The farm felt quiet now, almost too quiet. When we finally got inside, we found my sister and her friends hanging out in the living room, watching a movie just like usual. They looked at us, surprised. "I thought you guys were down by the river," my sister said. "Yeah, we were," I said, "but someone was here, watching us." She gave me a weird look. "What do you mean? We haven't been down there." One of her friends nodded. "We were here the whole time. You know it takes us at least 20 minutes to get down to the river from here. You got here way before we could have." I stared at them. They were right. My parents confirmed it too. They had been inside all evening. That meant the figure I saw, whoever it was not my sister or her friends. We checked the quad and the campfire the next day. The fire was still smoldering but fading fast. No footprints, no sign of anyone else around. Just the quiet and the soft sound of the river. I kept thinking about that figure, the way they stood there so still and silent, watching us, waiting. It made no sense. Who was that person? Why had they been there? Were they just some stranger passing through? Or something worse? Even writing this now, months later, I still can't explain it. There were no clues, no sign of a campsite, no tracks on the dirt road. Just me, my mate, and that silent watcher in the scrub. That night changed how I felt about camping on the farm. What used to feel like a safe, familiar place suddenly seemed vulnerable and strange. Now, when I drive down that road toward the river, I'm always looking over my shoulder, because sometimes the things you see in the dark aren't people you know. And sometimes, they're not people at all. But whatever it was that night, I'll never forget the look it gave me. The cold, steady gaze of someone, or something, waiting silently in the dark, just beyond the firelight. I was driving down from Anchorage to Seattle, making my way through British Columbia. The trip was long, with plenty of stops to rest and camp along the way. I had my car packed with everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, and all the usual camping gear. I wasn't in a rush. Part of the journey was to enjoy the wilderness, see the forests and mountains, and spend nights under the stars. One night, I found a small campground just off the highway. It wasn't fancy, just a clearing with a few spots next to a thick patch of woods. The campsite was quiet, mostly empty except for a few cars here and there. I picked a spot near the trees, thinking the shade would be nice in the morning. The ground was soft, covered with pine needles and a few fallen leaves. I set up my tent quickly. It was a lightweight model with thin walls, mostly mesh except for the rainfly, which I left off because the forecast didn't call for rain. Inside the tent, the mesh walls let in the sounds and smells of the forest. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, and the cool night air pressing against the thin fabric. I liked feeling close to nature like that, even if it meant the tent wasn't much of a barrier. I went to sleep, tired from the day's drive. The night was calm, the forest quiet except for the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes. I was comfortable, wrapped in my sleeping bag, feeling the earth beneath me. Then morning came. I woke slowly, eyes still closed. The light was faint, just enough to make out shapes through the mesh walls. I felt something heavy pressing close to the side of the tent. I didn't open my eyes right away, but then I felt it again. A warm breath, low and slow, brushing against the mesh. I opened my eyes a little and froze. Right there, about 3 feet from my face, pressed against the outside of the tent, was a large black bear. It was huge, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen in pictures. Its dark fur was thick and coarse, shining faintly in the soft morning light. But the most terrifying part wasn't its size or its fur. It was the angle. Because the bear was standing right next to me, looking down, I was staring straight up at its underbelly. If you've never looked up at the underside of a big black bear, consider yourself lucky. The way its fur clumped unevenly, the rough skin beneath, the pads of its paws visible just beyond the mesh. It was a raw, powerful, and very real thing. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. The bear's breath was slow and steady, warm against the cool fabric of the tent. Its eyes were dark, almost curious, but also wary. I didn't move. I didn't breathe more than I had to. I was locked in place, heart hammering so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. The bear's nose twitched against the mesh. It sniffed the air, probably smelling me. I thought about all the stories I'd heard. Bears breaking into tents, attacks, people hurt or worse. But this bear didn't act aggressive. It was more cautious than anything. I slowly reached for my phone, but it was on the other side of the tent, and I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I knew panicking could make things worse. I kept my eyes on the bear's face, willing it to lose interest and move on. Minutes passed like hours. The bear shifted slightly, the sound of its claws brushing the ground and scratching against the tent's thin fabric. I could feel every breath, every movement. It was the most intense and terrifying experience of my life. Then, as quietly as it had come, the bear backed away, turned and padded off into the trees without a sound. I stayed still, waiting to make sure it really was gone. When I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, the reality of what had just happened hit me. I had been inches away from a wild bear, sharing the same small space, separated only by a thin mesh wall. I packed up my tent right after that, not wanting to stay another minute. The thought of the bear coming back during the night or another one arriving was too much. I moved my camp to a more open area, farther from the woods, and made sure to keep all food secured away from where I would sleep. The experience changed how I saw camping. Being in the wilderness means being close to animals that don't belong to us. It means respecting their space, knowing that we are visitors in their home. The bear didn't attack. It was curious, or maybe just smelling for food. But the line between curiosity and danger is thin. From then on, every time I camped near woods, I remembered that morning. The feel of the bear's breath on the tent, the sound of its claws, the look at its underbelly so close it almost felt like I could reach out and touch it. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's not safe. It's wild, alive, and full of things we can't control. That night in BC, I learned that lesson in the most real and frightening way possible. And I carry it with me every time I set up a tent in the dark. I'll never forget the trip we took into the Absaroka Wilderness in Wyoming. It was supposed to be a straightforward group hike and camping weekend. A break from city life and a chance to be fully out in the wild. We were a group of 6, all friends or friends of friends, fairly experienced hikers but not experts. We planned to trek into the backcountry, far from roads and cell service, and set up camp in some of the most remote parts of the Absarokas. The mountains, there are beautiful, rugged peaks, thick forests, and wide-open meadows that stretch for miles. It was exactly the kind of place to get away from it all. Our gear was heavy but solid: tents, backpacks, food supplies, sleeping bags, portable stoves. We carried everything we needed, expecting to be completely on our own for a few days. The hike was long and tough. The trails were narrow and rocky, weaving through dense pine and spruce trees. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. On the second day, after hours of hiking, we finally reached a campsite near a small clearing by a creek. From the looks of it, the spot had been used before. The ground was flattened in a circle, and tree branches around the area had deep scratch marks, claw marks, no doubt from bears. The trees bore evidence of large animals moving through the area, clawing at bark and leaving long, deep scratches. We set up our tents carefully, keeping food secured and away from sleeping areas to avoid attracting any bears. The group was cautious but tried not to worry too much. We'd all read about bears and knew the risks, but no one expected what we'd find nearby later that day. After everything was set up, one of the group members, Mike, wandered a little ways down the trail. He called us over when he found something strange: an abandoned campsite. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter of a mile from where we were, but it looked like it had been completely forgotten, left behind suddenly and weeks ago, if not longer. The scene was chilling. There was a torn tent collapsed on the ground, no longer standing or functional. Sleeping bags lay spread out, some still inside the tent's frame, but covered in dirt and leaves. Clothes were scattered around haphazardly. Jackets, socks, a pair of hiking boots overturned near the edge of the clearing. It looked like someone had just vanished, left everything behind as if they'd been forced to run off into the forest or something worse. The gear wasn't ours. None of us recognized it, and it was old enough that dirt and moss had started growing on parts of it. The smell was musty and sour from the dampness and decay. But what was most disturbing was how complete the setup was. This wasn't a forgotten cache of supplies or a casual stopover. It was a full campsite, ready for someone to stay, but the owners were nowhere to be found. We looked around the clearing carefully. The ground was disturbed, and there were signs of struggle: broken branches, footprints leading away but fading into the dense forest. It felt like a mystery with no answers, a story left untold but clearly not good. That night, as we sat around our campfire, the image of the abandoned campsite haunted me. The silence of the forest was heavier, the shadows thicker. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves felt amplified, like the wilderness was holding its breath. We kept watch, taking turns staying awake, alert for any sounds or movements around our own camp. The bare scratches on the trees reminded us that we were not alone in this wilderness, but the abandoned site added a new level of fear. It meant that something had happened here, something that made people disappear, leaving behind only their things. Sleep was uneasy. The wind moaned through the trees, and the creek nearby sounded louder in the stillness of night. I thought about the people who had left that campsite. What had happened to them? Had they encountered wildlife? Had they gotten lost, or worse? The thought of their sudden disappearance weighed heavily. The next morning, we packed up quickly. None of us wanted to stay another night near the abandoned site. We moved on, hiking farther into the wilderness, but the sense of unease stayed with me. The beauty of the Absarcas was still there, but so was the knowledge that the wild holds secrets, dark, untold stories hidden beneath the trees and rocks. When we finally made it back to civilization, the experience stayed with me. I never told anyone outside our group about the abandoned campsite. It felt too real, too raw. The wilderness is not just a place of peace and beauty. It can be dangerous and unforgiving. The Absarca Mountains remind me that even in places that look untouched, people can disappear and mysteries remain unsolved. I still wonder about that campsite. Who were the owners? What forced them to leave everything behind? The answers may never come, but the memory is a warning. Respect the wilderness, stay alert, and know that sometimes what you find out there is far from peaceful. The summer my little brother graduated from high school, my family decided to do something different to celebrate. A water camping trip on a huge lake system, the kind where the water spreads out over miles and miles with thick forests surrounding almost every shore. We rented a houseboat for the weekend, a big one with a kitchen, sleeping rooms, and a top deck for sitting outside and watching the sunset. The lake was remote, way off any main roads, surrounded by dense forest and narrow bays where only boats like ours could go. We wanted to get as far away from the noise and crowds as possible. I liked the idea of being out in nature, but I was also a little nervous about being so isolated. We spent the first day cruising around, finding quiet spots to anchor and explore. My brother was excited, proud to be the center of attention, and my parents seemed relaxed for once, away from their usual work stress. The water was warm and clean, perfect for swimming. That night, we anchored the boat near a small, forested cove. The trees pressed close to the shore, their dark shapes blocking out most of the stars overhead. The only light came from the lamps on the boat and the soft glow of the moon. The air was cool and smelled like wet pine and fresh water. After we finished setting up for the night, my family settled inside the boat. I decided to swim along the shore, away from the boat just a little bit, to clear my head and enjoy the quiet water. The lake was calm, and the water felt smooth and cool against my skin as I moved through it. I swam close to the shore, where the water was shallow and I could see the dark shapes of tree roots and rocks just beneath the surface. The trees themselves stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Then I saw him, a man standing motionless at the edge of the forest, just beyond where the trees met the shore. He was lit by the faint light from the boat, but mostly he was a dark silhouette against the trees. At first, I thought he might be fishing or watching the water, but then I noticed what he was doing. He was jerking off. I froze, my heart hammered in my chest. I wasn't sure if he'd seen me or not, but I was terrified of drawing attention to myself. I wasn't anywhere near my family. I was alone in the water, and the shore was dense with trees and brush. I quickly ducked underwater and swam back toward the boat as fast as I could without making a big splash. I kept my head under until I was close enough to grab the ladder. I pulled myself up and climbed onto the deck, shaking and trying to calm my breathing. The image stuck in my mind, haunting me. The way he just stood there, watching the water, his eyes fixed on nothing, his movements slow and deliberate. It was gross and creepy, and it made me feel unsafe, like the peaceful night had suddenly turned dangerous. I knew I had to tell someone, but I couldn't bring myself to yell or make a scene. Instead, I quietly tried to get my family's attention, making motions toward the shore. It was hard convincing them to move the boat, especially after we'd just anchored and settled in. But eventually, my parents agreed, probably because they could see how upset I was. We pulled up the anchor and moved the boat to a different spot, farther away from the shore and the dark tree line. The new spot felt better, more open, with a clearer view of the water on all sides. But even after moving, the feeling didn't leave me. Every time I looked at the dark forest around the lake, especially near the shore, I felt uneasy. The trees, which had looked peaceful and beautiful during the day, now seemed like hiding places for something unknown, something watching. I kept thinking about that man. Who was he? Why was he there in the middle of nowhere, alone in the dark, doing something so disturbing. What would have happened if I hadn't seen him first? What if he was waiting for someone or watching other boats? I stayed close to the boat the rest of the night, avoiding the water completely. I couldn't sleep well, my mind racing with the image and all the what-ifs. The peaceful trip we'd planned felt ruined. The next day, we left the remote spot early. No one wanted to stay longer, not with the memory of that night hanging over us. My family said nothing about it, but I could tell they felt it too. The discomfort, the realization that even the most beautiful places can hide dark moments. Looking back, I know I did the right thing by trusting my gut and insisting we move the boat. That night reminded me how important it is to listen to your instincts when something feels off, even if you can't explain it. Out in the wild, surrounded by water and trees, the silence can be broken by more than just animals. That trip changed how I see the lake and the forest. Now, every time I see a dark tree line by the shore, I remember the man standing there and the chill that ran down my spine. It wasn't the peaceful nature I wanted to escape to. It was a reminder that sometimes danger hides just beyond the water's edge, waiting quietly in the dark. I never thought a simple camping trip with my roommates could turn into something so unsettling. It started as a weekend escape, a way to get away from the noise of the city, the stress of work, and just breathe fresh air for a couple of days. We picked a spot that was far from the main road, deep into the woods. Not many people came out that far, so the campsite was completely empty. It felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. We drove in late afternoon, the sun hanging low but still warm. The gravel road ended, and we parked the car near a narrow trail that led us to a small clearing surrounded by tall pine and birch trees. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Birds were chirping, but mostly it was quiet, perfect for a weekend of peace. We hauled all our gear from the car: backpacks, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food and drinks, and the tent, a big 6-person tent that was our shared home for the night. The guys were excited, joking around as they set up the tent while I gathered firewood. The wood was dry but old enough to make a decent fire. We built the fire pit carefully, arranging stones in a circle to keep the fire contained. The last thing any of us wanted was to start a forest fire. By the time the tent was pitched, the fire was crackling warmly, and the sky was already turning dark, stars beginning to peek through the fading light. We ate some simple food, canned chili heated over the fire, a couple of beers, and some marshmallows for dessert. The forest around us was alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. When it was time to go to bed, we all climbed into the tent. It was tight for 6 people, but we managed to squeeze in. We zipped the tent closed, shut off the fire, and lay down on our sleeping pads. The night was cool but not cold. The tent's fabric kept most of the chill out. I drifted off fairly quickly, comforted by the sounds of nature around us, but then I woke up. It was around 2 a.m. At first, I was disoriented, unsure where I was, but then I heard it, a sound coming from outside the tent. It was a soft, slow scratching noise, like someone running their hand lightly along the outside fabric of the tent as they circled it. It wasn't random, it had rhythm. It made the tent's walls vibrate slightly. I turned my head and looked around at my roommates. Some of them were awake, their eyes wide, breathing shallow. I could tell they were scared. The noise was real, not an animal, not the wind. It sounded deliberate. I tried to stay calm. Part of me wanted to unzip the tent and see who was out there, but the other part knew that could be dangerous. The area was so remote. We were a long way from the main road, and the closest neighbor was miles away. If it was a person with bad intentions, I didn't want to meet them face to face, especially not alone or without a weapon. The noise kept moving around the tent slowly, the scratching coming back every few seconds, as if someone was walking all the way around, their hand grazing the fabric. My heart was pounding, but I kept still. I glanced at my roommates again, and I saw their fear. Some whispered prayers in their heads, others held their phones ready, hoping for a signal that wasn't there. I wanted to tell them to stay quiet, not to make any sudden moves, but none of us spoke. We just listened. Then the scratching stopped. For what felt like a long time, there was silence. Not a single leaf rustled. No birds, no animals. The forest seemed to hold its breath with us. After a while, I told myself to try to sleep. Maybe it was just some stranger playing a cruel joke. Maybe it was a lost hunter or a drifter passing through. But I wasn't ready to deal with it. So I turned away and closed my eyes, pretending to sleep. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, I drifted back into a restless sleep. Morning came, though it didn't bring much relief. When we finally zipped open the tent, the first thing we noticed was the ground around us. There were footprints, not ours. They circled the entire tent, making a perfect ring around us. The prints were deep, like whoever left them was heavy or wearing boots with thick soles. The prints were fresh, pressed into the damp soil and scattered leaves. We stared at them for a long time, the weight of what happened sinking in. Whoever had been outside the tent wasn't just wandering by. They had come close, touched our tent, walked around it, and then left. No one said a word, but we all knew the trip had changed. The forest wasn't a peaceful escape anymore. It was a place where someone had watched us, quietly and carefully, all night. We packed up quickly after breakfast. None of us wanted to stay another night, and even though no one had shown themselves beyond the noises and the prints, we all felt unsafe. The drive back to the main road was tense. We didn't speak much, just kept our eyes on the trees, half expecting to see someone following us. Looking back now, I think about what could have happened if I had decided to confront whoever was outside. Maybe it was nothing dangerous. Maybe it was just a lost traveler. But there was something about the way those footsteps circled our tent that made it clear it wasn't random. Felt like a warning or a test. The next time I went camping, I stayed much closer to the road, and I never went off by myself or with just a small group again. That night taught me how quickly things can go from peaceful to frightening. How thin the line is between nature's calm and real danger. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that scratching noise in my mind, slow and deliberate, like someone tracing the outside of my safe space, waiting. It was one of those days where everything feels like it's going fine, until it suddenly isn't. My friend and I had gone for what we thought would be a quick hike, but somehow it stretched on longer than either of us expected. We underestimated the trails, the terrain, and honestly, ourselves. By the time we turned around to head back, darkness had fully settled in. The sun was gone, swallowed by thick clouds or the tall trees around us. We had no choice but to rely on our phone torches, small, weak beams of light, to find our way. Our campsite was a lonely on Google Maps, somewhere in the middle of a wide stretch of green that looked like an uncharted wilderness. No roads, no clear paths marked, just a vague point in the middle of nothing much. We weren't exactly sure of the route back. We had relied on the hike itself to take us to where we wanted to be, but now, lost in the dark, every step felt uncertain. We pushed through a thick line of bushes, branches snapping underfoot, leaves brushing against our faces. My phone torch shone ahead, cutting a small circle of light into the blackness. My friend's torch flickered next to mine, and I could just make out his face, tense, eyes wide, trying to peer into the shadows. Then suddenly we saw them. At first, it was just one pair of eyes, reflecting the weak torchlight back at us. Then two, then a dozen. Dozens of small, shiny eyes glowing quietly in the darkness. For a moment, I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The silence stretched. We didn't move, didn't speak, just stared into the darkness, the glowing eyes fixed on us. The stories you hear about being watched out in the wild rushed through my head. Wild animals, predators, worse. Fear wrapped around me like a cold blanket. But then, after those long, terrifying seconds, we realized what those eyes belonged to. Sheep, a whole field of them. We'd stumbled right into a sheep field, thick with woolly animals that seemed to appear from nowhere in the night. I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Here we were, panicking over a bunch of harmless sheep. The sheep blinked their big eyes at us, their bodies barely visible except for the soft glow reflected in their eyes. Their breathing sounded quiet but steady. They moved slowly, chewing on grass and looking mildly interested. We were stuck in the field, and it wasn't as easy to leave as we'd hoped. The fence we had passed earlier wasn't where we thought it was, and the sheep crowded around us, blocking our way. The ground was uneven, thick with tall grass and mud patches. The smell was strong, that earthy, slightly sour smell of animals and damp soil. Our phones buzzed faintly with low battery warnings, and the cold was settling in deeper. We started walking slowly, careful not to startle the sheep too much. Any loud noise could send them scattering, and then we'd be trying to navigate through a stampede in total darkness. The sheep field stretched for what felt like miles, but was probably just a few hundred yards. Our torches barely illuminated the way ahead, and the crowd of sheep seemed to close in around us. My friend joked quietly about how these sheep might have been the real guardians of the forest, silent watchers in the dark. I wasn't laughing much. At some point, we found a break in the brush and spotted the fence again, just beyond a small rise. We carefully made our way toward it, stepping over rocks and pushing through branches. The fence was low, made of wooden posts and wire. We couldn't just climb over without risking injury in the dark, so we searched for the gate. Eventually, we found the gate. It was old and rusty, but it opened with a creak that felt louder than a gunshot in the quiet night. The sheep hesitated but didn't follow us out. We slipped through, hearts still racing. Once on the other side, we started jogging, eager to put distance between ourselves and the field. The trees thinned, and we finally spotted the faint glow of our campfire in the distance. Relief washed over me like a wave. Back at camp, we sat down, still catching our breath. We checked our phones again. Barely enough battery to call for help if we had needed it. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes in the dark. The way they'd watched us, silent and still, for so long. How something so harmless could feel so eerie in the wrong moment. That night, I learned something important. Sometimes the scariest moments aren't about actual danger. They're about the fear of the unknown, the silence, the waiting, the feeling of being watched by eyes you can't see. It wasn't wolves or bears or anything dangerous, just sheep. But in the dark, with nothing but weak phone lights and the cold air pressing down, that was enough to make me freeze. The next day, when the sun was high and bright, we went back to the field. It looked completely different, peaceful, quiet, with sheep lazily grazing on grass. No glowing eyes, no silent watchers, just sheep. From then on, I always made sure to keep a better map, carry a real flashlight, and never underestimate the landscape or the animals. Because sometimes the quiet, the dark, and the unknown can turn even the most harmless things into something that makes your skin crawl. I know I'm late to the party with this one. Everyone's already shared their creepy camping stories, and I've been quiet. But my mother's story, the one she told me a while back, stuck with me. It's not a ghost story, not some crazy urban legend. It's pure, raw, real danger. The kind that stays with you. I want to tell it because I think people should hear it, especially those who think camping is all fun and games. It's a serious thing out there, especially in places most of us have never been. When my parents were in their late 20s, long before I was born, they spent a few years teaching in Lesotho, a small country in southern Africa. During their holidays, they liked to explore the massive national parks in Zimbabwe. The parks there aren't like your usual campgrounds with neat picnic tables and bathrooms. No, these places are wild, big open spaces filled with all kinds of animals, from harmless antelope to some real predators. They were young, adventurous, and honestly a bit reckless. They didn't know much about the dangers. And what makes it crazier, they brought my sister along. She was less than a year old at the time, just a tiny baby, too small to understand or defend herself. One particular trip still haunts my mother's memory. They had picked a quiet spot far away from other campers. The kind of place where you set up your tent and the nearest sound is the wind rustling the leaves or the distant calls of wild birds. My sister was between my mom and dad inside the tent, sleeping quietly. The night started peaceful. The sky was clear, the stars bright. But as it got darker, something changed. It started with a soft noise, coughing. Not the dry cough of a person, but a strange, rough sound coming from outside the tent. At first, my parents thought it was an animal, maybe a small one like a mongoose or a baboon. But then the coughing got louder. It was closer, and then it multiplied. The baby stirred and started making noises of her own. Little baby coos and cries. My parents noticed that the coughing sounds outside seemed to respond to the baby's noises, like they were drawing closer. It didn't take long before the coughing turned into the sounds of a whole group, a pack, circling their tent. My parents heard heavy breathing, sniffing, and something that sounded like scratching at the ground near the tent's edges. They didn't have any weapons nearby. No firearms, no knife or axe within reach. Just their own fear and quick thinking. Suddenly, the tent fabric rippled as something large pressed against it, sniffing near where my sister was lying. My mother remembers the panic, the surge of adrenaline that only a parent fearing for their child can understand. She said she could feel her heart pounding so loud it drowned out all other sounds. Then, without thinking, she reached out and punched the snout of the animal pushing against the tent. That animal was a hyena. From what she told me, the hyena screamed. A high-pitched, terrified scream, nothing like the usual eerie laughter you hear in documentaries. The other animals in the pack instantly scattered, as if that scream sent a signal to retreat. The night fell silent again, except for my sister's quiet crying. My father immediately zipped the tent closed, held my sister tightly, and they sat awake the rest of the night, listening for any signs of the pack returning. The next morning, they packed up quickly and moved their camp to a much safer spot closer to park rangers' posts. I can still see my mother's face when she tells this story. It's a mix of pride, disbelief, and the deep, raw emotion that comes from staring down danger and coming out alive. She said that moment changed everything for her. It was a brutal reminder that nature is not a playground, and that being a parent means sometimes finding strength you never knew you had. I've thought about that night a lot. The thought of a pack of wild hyenas circling a small tent with a baby inside is terrifying. But the real horror isn't just the animals. It's how unprepared and vulnerable they were. I've camped plenty since then, but never without respect for what's out there, waiting beyond the firelight. That story always reminds me, nature doesn't owe us safety. We owe it respect, and we owe it to ourselves and the people we care about to be ready. So yeah, my mother beat up a hyena, and she's not the kind of person who talks about it much, but when she does, you know it's a story you don't forget. And it's not just a story about a fight. It's about fear, survival, and the unexpected strength that comes when you have no choice but to protect what you love. I'm glad she made it through that night. I'm glad my sister did too, because if they hadn't, none of us would be here to tell the story.